always carried a certain kind of magic, or at least it used to, back when I was young enough to believe that magic was meant for everyone. The scent of cinnamon rolls drifted through the warm air, mingling with the sharp pine of the Christmas tree standing proudly in the living room. Outside, snow blanketed the ground in an undisturbed sheet of white, glittering under the soft morning sun. Inside, the fireplace crackled, and my parents' laughter filled the room as they moved about, setting last-minute presents underneath the tree. I stood by the doorway, half holding my breath, feeling a flicker of hope ignite in my chest. Maybe this year would be different. Maybe this year I would be seen. Mom called us over with a bright, excited voice. "Come on, everyone! Time for the big surprise!" My brother grinned, practically bouncing on his heels. He was always the golden boy, the one they boasted about. At every dinner party, the one who could do no wrong, even when he did. I had learned over the years to temper my expectations, but Christmas morning still had that stubborn sliver of magic I couldn't quite let go of. I crossed the room and sat down on the couch, trying to appear casual, though my heart thudded loudly against my ribs. Dad appeared, holding a small, neatly wrapped box. It wasn't particularly heavy, but the way he held it, the proud gleam in his eyes, made it feel like it contained the whole world. He handed it to my brother, who tore off the wrapping paper with the kind of reckless excitement only he could get away with. The box fell open, and inside sat a brand new car key, the shiny fob catching the light as if it had been waiting for this moment to announce itself. There was a beat of silence, the kind that stretches forever and yet passes in an instant. Then Mom clapped her hands together and said, beaming, "We bought him a car! Your dad and I thought he deserved it." Cheers erupted from the room. My brother whooped and jumped up to hug them both, lifting Dad off his feet in a show of exuberance. They laughed and patted his back, basking in the glow of their perfect Christmas scene. I sat frozen, my hands clasped together so tightly my knuckles turned white. I smiled because that's what you do. You smile so you don't cry. You smile so no one sees the crack forming deep inside you. Mom turned to me then, as if suddenly remembering I was there. She reached into her pocket and pulled out another key. For a fleeting, foolish second, my heart leapt. Maybe they had gotten something for me too. Maybe this wasn't going to be another Christmas where I was an afterthought. She held the key out to me, a casual, almost dismissive gesture. "This is a spare," she said lightly. "You can borrow it if you ever need to get somewhere." Borrow it. I could borrow it. My mouth went dry. Not mine. Not even a real gift. Just a contingency plan. A courtesy like offering an umbrella to a neighbor during a storm. My mouth went dry. I reached out, took the key, and muttered a thank you that scraped against my throat like broken glass. Nobody noticed the way my hands shook slightly as I tucked the key into my pocket. Nobody noticed the way my smile faltered around the edges. They had already turned their attention back to my brother, peppering him with questions about where he would drive first, how he would show it off to his friends, how proud they were of him. I sat there, feeling the edges of myself blur and disappear, fading into the furniture like a ghost. The tree lights blurred in my vision, little halos of color swimming before my eyes. I blinked rapidly, swallowing the lump rising in my throat. This wasn't new. This wasn't surprising. But somehow the sting never dulled, no matter how many times it happened. I spent the rest of the morning moving through the motions, opening a few small presents, thanking everyone with mechanical precision, laughing at the appropriate times. It was easier to play the role they expected than to confront the hollow ache gnawing at my chest. Knowing at my chest, I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself gifts were just things, but deep down I knew it wasn't about the car or the key. It was about what the car represented: value, love, pride, and about how easily, how naturally I was deemed unworthy of those things. Later, when the chaos had settled and everyone was napping or engrossed in their new gadgets, I slipped outside. The cold air bit at my skin, sharper than any slap could have been. I walked down the driveway, my boots crunching in the snow, until I reached a shiny new car parked proudly at the curb. It gleamed in the winter sun, a bright, beautiful symbol of everything I wasn't. I pulled the spare key from my pocket and stared at it, a gesture. A placeholder. A reminder. You can borrow it if you need to. I squeezed the key tightly until the metal dug into my palm, grounding me, anchoring me to the moment. And then, slowly, I slipped it back into my coat pocket and turned away. I didn't need their borrowed things. I didn't need their borrowed things. I didn't need their afterthoughts or their pity disguised as generosity. If there was anything this Christmas morning had taught me, had confirmed, it was that I would never be their chosen one. I would always be the one standing in the background, applauding someone else's victories, holding someone else's spare keys, but not forever. As I trudged back up the driveway, snow swirling around my ankles, a new kind of resolve hardened inside me. I would build my own life. I would buy my own car. I would carve out a place in the world that didn't depend on being handed scraps at someone else's table. I wasn't sure how yet. I didn't have a plan or money, or even a starting point, but I had the wound, and sometimes a wound was all you needed to finally start healing. In the days that followed Christmas morning, I carried the key in my pocket like a stone, heavy and cold against my leg. Every time I shifted, every time I sat down or moved too quickly, I felt it press against me, a sharp, cold reminder of where I stood in the hierarchy of my own family. It became a kind of silent companion, a physical echo of everything I had spent years trying not to admit to myself. I wasn't. I had spent years trying not to admit the favorite I wasn't, even close. I was the spare, the backup plan, the afterthought. And that realization, though, not new, had a finality to it now that it hadn't before. I didn't confront them. I didn't scream or cry or demand to know why. I just absorbed it, added it to the long, quiet ledger I had been keeping since childhood. Christmas morning had another tally mark under not enough. Another memory to pack away with all the others, each one folding neatly over the last, until the weight of them was something I carried without even noticing. Most days, in the quiet moments between obligations, when the house was still, when my brother was out showing off his new car to friends, when my parents sat contentedly in the living room, basking in the glow of their perfect Christmas, I thought back to all the times I had swallowed disappointment in silence. There was the birthday party when I turned 10, when my parents accidentally double-booked a golf tournament for my brother on the same day. They told me we'd celebrate later. I spent the afternoon at home, but later never came. I spent the afternoon at home, blowing out candles on a cupcake I'd frosted myself, pretending it didn't hurt. There was the time I won a regional science fair, the only real accolade I'd ever earned that wasn't immediately dismissed as nice, but not as impressive as your brother's football championship. They hadn't even come to the award ceremony. "It's just a little school thing," Mom had said when I'd asked. And then there were all the little moments, the ones too small to name individually, but devastating in their accumulation. Being the last to know about family plans, being handed leftover hand-me-downs wrapped up to look like gifts. Hearing them talk about my brother's future in glowing terms, while I was described as independent, which sounded like a compliment until you realized it was a polite way of saying they didn't bother thinking about you. I used to think if I just worked harder, if I just became more impressive, more successful, more something they would see me. They would be proud. They would love. I used to think me the way they so easily loved him. But standing there holding that spare key, I finally understood it had never been about me. It had never been about what I did or didn't do. Their favoritism was ingrained, a choice they made over and over again without even realizing it. And I was tired of chasing after a prize that had already been given to someone else before the race even started. So I stopped. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Quietly, like a fire that burns itself down to embers and then goes cold. I stopped volunteering for extra favors, stopped going out of my way to be helpful or available. Stopped rearranging my life to accommodate their needs or their emergencies. I became polite but distant, like a guest overstaying their welcome. They noticed in the way people notice a favorite chair isn't quite as comfortable anymore. Mild irritation, confusion, but no real concern. Concern. "You're so busy these days," Mom would say with a frown, as if busy was a crime. "You're always running off somewhere," Dad added once, shaking his head like I was some kind of disappointment. I smiled and, yes, I was busy, agreed. Yes, I was busy. Yes, I had things to do. Yes, I was running, but not away from anything. I was running towards something, even if I didn't know what it was yet. The first step was reclaiming my time. I started accepting more hours at my part-time job, picking up freelance work online whenever I could. I spent late nights teaching myself new skills, graphic design, copywriting, basic coding, anything that might help me build a future that wasn't tethered to their approval. It wasn't glamorous. Most days I was exhausted, juggling shifts and gigs and coursework. I lived on instant noodles and coffee, counted every penny, sacrificed weekends and social plans. But every time I deposited a check, no matter how small, I felt a spark of something I hadn't felt in years. Agency, control, hope. Agency, control. I didn't tell them about any of it. When they asked how things were going, I smiled and said, fine. When they invited me to family dinners I knew would turn into impromptu celebrations of my brother's latest achievement, I politely declined, citing work or other commitments. I stopped looking for validation from people who had shown me time and again that they were incapable of giving it. And slowly, the wound that Christmas morning had torn open began to scar over, not because they changed. They didn't. If anything, they grew more baffled by my growing distance, more critical of my choices. Why aren't you around more? Mom would ask, genuinely confused. You know family is everything. I wanted to laugh every time she said it. Family was everything to them. To me, family had become a lesson in survival. The deeper I dug into my work, the more opportunities opened up. I landed a steady freelance gig that paid better than anything I'd ever had before. I started saving, really saving, for the first time in my life. I opened a separate bank account, one they didn't know about, one they couldn't touch or guilt me into sharing. With each small success, I felt a piece of myself slip back into place. Not the version of me they wanted, the beautiful, grateful, invisible daughter, but the real version, the one who knew her worth even if no one else did. I moved through birthdays, anniversaries, and even another Christmas with quiet detachment. I showed up when necessary, smiled for photos, exchanged gifts, but I no longer let myself hope for anything more. I no longer set myself up for disappointment by expecting them to notice or care about what was really happening in my life. They didn't see me. Quiet detachment, saving for my own car. They didn't see the long nights and early mornings, the contracts, negotiated over coffee-stained laptops, the quiet victories that added up to something real. And I preferred it that way. Let them believe I was still the same spare part, still the fallback plan. It made it easier to move unnoticed, to build my escape route brick by careful brick. The only thing that hurt sometimes was the moments of almost. The moments when Mom would hug my brother and say how proud she was of him, how lucky they were to have him, and then turn to me with a polite smile and a, "You're doing good too, sweetie," as if I was an afterthought in my own story. But one evening, even that thing dulled over time. Not because it mattered less, but because I mattered more to myself. One evening, about a year after that Christmas, I sat at my tiny kitchen table in my tiny rented apartment and realized I was happier than I had ever been in that big family house. It wasn't much, it wasn't fancy or flashy, but it was mine. Bought with my own money, built with my own hands, sustained by my own will. The key they had given me that Christmas was still tucked in a drawer somewhere. Forgotten. I hadn't needed it since the day they handed it to me. I had borrowed nothing. I had built everything. And the plan had been best part. They didn't even know what was coming next. The plan had been simple, at least in theory. Work, save, and build a life that belonged to me. But as the months went by, the reality proved to be more complicated, more exhausting, and eventually more rewarding than I had ever imagined. I worked through weekends, through holidays, through every birthday I spent alone, because family gatherings felt more like reminders of what I wasn't than celebrations of who I was. I answered emails at midnight, juggled projects and contracts with aching hands and a mind that often begged for rest. There were nights when exhaustion weighed on me so heavily, I would sit on the edge of my bed, staring blankly at the wall, wondering if I was making a mistake, wondering if I should have just accepted my role in the family dynamics, played the beautiful part, taking whatever scraps of affection were offered. But then I remembered the way the car key had felt in my hand at Christmas morning. I remembered the polite indifference on my mother's face, the unconscious dismissal in her voice, first tangible milestone. You can borrow it if you need to. Those words lived inside me like a heartbeat, pushing me forward every time I wanted to stop. The first tangible milestone was when I finally bought my own car. It wasn't a brand new luxury vehicle like the one my brother had received. It was a 2-year-old, gently used sedan that I found after weeks of careful searching, negotiating, and budgeting. It was practical, reliable, and most importantly, it was mine. I remember the day I picked it up from the dealership, the salesman handing me the keys with a smile, congratulating me like I had just achieved something monumental. And in a driving home way, I had. I slid into the driver's seat, closed the door, and for a long moment just sat there, breathing in the scent of my very own freedom. Driving home, I didn't blast music or call anyone to share the news. I didn't text pictures to my parents or post celebratory announcements online. I simply drove, windows down, letting the wind whip through my hair, feeling lighter than I had in years. This wasn't something they could loan me. It wasn't something they could dangle over my head. It was mine, fully and completely. But the car was just the beginning. With my freelance income growing steadily, I started dreaming bigger. I didn't just want to exist independently. I wanted to thrive. I wanted a place of my own, something permanent, something that could never be confused for a borrowed privilege. I started attending open houses on weekends, poring over listings late at night, running the numbers over and over again. It seemed impossible at first, a pipe dream for someone like me who had spent most of her life being treated as an afterthought. But slowly, methodically, the pieces began to fall into place. I found a small condo on the edge of the city. It wasn't flashy, but it was bright and clean, with big windows that let the sun pour in and just enough space for me to breathe. I scraped together the down payment through sheer force of will, cashing in every side hustle, every freelance. Check every ounce of discipline I could muster. Signing the paperwork felt surreal, like stepping into a version of my life I had once been too afraid to imagine. The day I got the keys, I didn't tell anyone. I stood in the middle of the empty living room, the walls bare and echoing my footsteps, and let the weight of it sink into my bones. This was mine. This was real. This was mine. I wasn't borrowing it. I wasn't waiting for permission. I had carved it out of the world with my own hands. Of course, my family found out eventually. News like that travels even when you're trying to keep it close to your chest. My brother heard from a mutual acquaintance that I had bought a place, and he let it slip during a family dinner I hadn't been invited to. Suddenly, there were texts from my mother, messages from my father, all asking questions laced with a thinly veiled tone of incredulity. How did you... Suddenly, there were texts. Afford that? Why didn't you tell us? Are you sure you can handle that on your own? Each question was a reminder of how little they believed in me, how little they had ever expected from me, how small they still thought I was. I responded politely but firmly, letting them know that yes, I could handle it. No, I didn't need help. No, I wasn't struggling. I didn't offer details. I didn't invite them over for a tour. This life I was building wasn't for them to critique or take credit for. It was mine. The distance between us grew wider, but I didn't mourn it. I had spent too many years mourning what never was. I was done, grieving a family dynamic that had never truly included me. One afternoon, about 6 months after moving into my condo, I stumbled across an old family group chat while clearing out my phone. Scrolling through the messages felt like flipping through a photo album of someone else's life, a life I no longer belonged to and no longer wanted to. Pictures of my brother's car, updates about his promotions, inside jokes I hadn't been part of. There were no updates about me, no questions about how I was doing, no congratulations on my milestones, just silence. Polite and absolute. I deleted the chat without hesitation. In its place, I created a new group, just me and a few close friends who had cheered me on without ever once asking me to prove my worth. Around that same time, an opportunity fell into my lap that seemed almost too good to be true. A small but promising startup was looking for a freelance project manager, someone who could juggle tasks, manage timelines, and keep creative teams moving forward. The pay was better than anything I had ever made before, and the potential for growth was enormous. I applied, interviewed, and landed the contract. Within a few months, they offered me a full-time position with benefits and a salary that would have seemed laughably out of reach just a year prior. With that job came more financial freedom, more stability, more opportunities to dream even bigger. I upgraded my furniture, traded in my car for a newer model, traveled to places I had only ever seen in magazines. I poured time and money into hobbies I had once abandoned for lack of encouragement. Photography, writing, painting. My life blossomed, vibrant and full. A sharp contrast to the gray, muted existence I had led under the weight of my family's indifference. And still, I didn't tell them. Not out of spite, not out of anger, but because their validation was no longer the currency by which I measured my success. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their praise. I didn't need them to see me. I saw myself. One evening, while organizing a bookshelf in my condo, I came across the spare car key they had given me that fateful Christmas morning. I turned it over in my hand, feeling the familiar weight of it. It no longer made me ache. It no longer made me angry. It was just a key, a relic from a life I had outgrown. On impulse, I drove to my parents' house. I hadn't been there in months, maybe longer. The familiar ache in my chest threatened to rise as I pulled into the driveway, but I pushed it down. I wasn't here to reopen old wounds. I was here to close them for good. I left the key on the front porch, tucked inside a small envelope with a simple note. Thanks, but I won't be needing this. I didn't ring the doorbell. I didn't wait for them to find it. I got back into my car, my own car, and drove away without looking back. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the road. I rolled down the windows, letting the cool air fill the cabin. I felt weightless, untethered, free. I thought about all the years I had spent trying to be enough for people who had already made up their minds about me. All the ways I had twisted myself into knots, trying to fit into a mold that was never meant for me. And I realized somewhere, along the way, I had stopped needing them to see me, because I had finally learned to see myself. I wasn't the spare. I wasn't the afterthought. I wasn't the one borrowing life on someone else's terms. I was the driver now, the builder, the creator of my own story. And I was just getting started. The days after I left the spare key on my parents' porch passed without incident. No frantic calls, no guilt-laden messages, no desperate attempts to draw me back into the family fold. It was almost as if they didn't know how to respond to an act so simple, yet so final. Or maybe deep down, they had always understood this was coming, that a person can only stand at the margins for so long before they finally step away altogether. At first, I waited for something, a confrontation, an apology, a plea. But as the silence stretched out, it filled me not with sadness, but with a deep, unshakable peace. Their silence was confirmation of everything I had already known. I had never really belonged to them the way I had wished. I had only ever belonged to myself. I poured my energy into my new life, throwing myself into work, friendships, and personal growth. Each day I planted new seeds of independence, and every day they took root a little deeper. I learned to enjoy the simple moments: coffee on my balcony at sunrise, evenings spent curled up with a book of my choosing, weekends exploring new cities or hiking unfamiliar trails. No explanations, no borrowed time, no asking for permission to live. My world expanded, even as the one I had left behind shrank into a distant memory. Still, as the holidays approached again, the anniversary of that pivotal Christmas morning, I found myself reflecting more, often not with regret or longing, but with curiosity. I wondered how they would spin my absence this year. I imagined the familiar narratives. She's just so busy with work. She's always been independent. We gave her everything she needed. Lies, maybe not even deliberate ones, but lies nonetheless. Comfortable stories they told themselves so they wouldn't have to face the truth, that they had pushed me away long before I ever chose to leave. Christmas Eve arrived with a soft dusting of snow. The city glowed with warmth and festivity, lights twinkling in every shop window, the scent of roasted chestnuts and mulled wine filling the air. I had been invited to a friend's gathering, people who had over time become the family I had chosen for myself. But before joining them, I decided to take a detour out of something resembling closure, not nostalgia. I drove past my parents' neighborhood. The house was lit up, a garish display of blinking lights and inflatable decorations cluttering the lawn. Through the windows, I caught glimpses of the familiar, my brother laughing loudly, my parents bustling about with trays of food, extended family members chatting over eggnog. The same scene year after year, like a play that kept being staged long after its audience had moved on. I pulled over down the street where they couldn't see me and sat for a moment, engine idling softly. I felt nothing, no bitterness, no sorrow, just a distant kind of observation, like watching strangers through a window on a passing train. Once I had ached to be inside that house, to be woven into that tableau of belonging. Once I would have given anything for a seat at that table, for a place in that story. But now I understood that the story had never been mine to begin with. And that was okay, because I had written later that night a new one. I stayed for only a minute before driving away, feeling lighter with each mile that separated me from that house. Later that night, surrounded by friends who knew me, who loved me not because they had to, but because they chose to, I celebrated a different kind of Christmas. There were no grand gestures, no expensive gifts, no hollow rituals, just laughter, shared stories, and a quiet, abiding sense of home. As midnight approached, my phone buzzed. A message from my mother, a terse, impersonal, Merry Christmas. No questions. My phone buzzed about where I was. No acknowledgement of the year that had passed between us like an unbridgeable gulf. Just 2 words, as obligatory as a signature at the bottom of the form. I stared at the screen for a moment, then set the phone down without responding. Not out of anger, not out of spite, but because there was nothing more to say. Our conversations had always been one-sided, and I had finally learned how to protect the parts of myself that could no longer afford to be unseen. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The seasons shifted, the world spun on, and I continued building the life I had once only dreamed about. Promotions came, friendships deepened, adventures unfolded. I learned to celebrate my own victories, to comfort myself in defeats, to stand wholly on my own 2 feet. There were moments of sadness. Sadness, of course. Some nights I would catch a familiar scent or hear a song from my childhood and feel a pain deep in my chest. Grief for the family I had never really had. Grief for the girl who had waited so long to be chosen. But grief, I learned, is not something to be feared. It is simply love with nowhere to go. And love, even unrequited, even misdirected, is still beautiful. In time, after that fateful Christmas, the grief became a kind of companion, not a chain around my ankles, but a gentle hand at my back, reminding me of how far I had come. About 1.5 years after that fateful Christmas, I attended a local community event, a fundraiser for small businesses. As fate would have it, my parents were there too, manning a booth for a charity they supported. Our eyes met across the crowded plaza, a brief spark of recognition flashing between us before being quickly extinguished. They approached hesitantly. "Hey," my mother said, her voice strained but polite. "We didn't expect to see you here." I smiled, not coldly, but with a calm they couldn't penetrate. "Yeah, I live nearby now." "You look good," my father added. "Now you look good," as if surprised. "I am good," I replied simply. There was an awkward silence, filled with all the things we would never say, apologies that would never be offered, acknowledgments that would finally, my mother ventured, never be made. Finally, my mother ventured, "You should come by the house sometime." The invitation hung there, flimsy and insincere, like a tattered flag over a conquered fort. I considered it for a moment, not out of longing, but out of the invitation hung there courtesy. Maybe, I said, knowing full well I wouldn't, and they knew it too. We parted ways shortly after, polite nods and hollow promises exchanged. I watched them walk away, their figures growing smaller in the crowd, and in that moment I realized I wasn't angry, I wasn't heartbroken, I wasn't even nostalgic, I was free. They could no longer hurt me with their favoritism, their neglect, their indifference. They could no longer define my worth or dictate the terms of my existence. I had taken that power back, piece by painstaking piece, and now it belonged entirely to me. They watched me leave that day, just as they had watched me drift away all those months ago. But this time, I wasn't leaving out of pain. I was leaving out of choice, out of love for myself, for the life I had built, for the person I had fought so hard to become. And for the first time in my life, you would be chosen. I didn't look back. Life has a way of teaching you the most profound lessons, not through grand gestures, but through small, quiet moments. The ones that leave invisible scars and shape the way you see the world. Growing up, I believed that love was something you earned, that if you were good enough, smart enough, helpful enough, you would be chosen. You would be seen. You would be valued. I spent years chasing that validation, twisting myself into whatever shape I thought my family wanted from me, only to find that no amount of effort could fill a space I had never been given permission to occupy. The moment that changed everything wasn't loud or dramatic. It was a simple Christmas morning, a spare key handed over like an afterthought, a borrowed kindness that crystallized a lifetime of feeling like an outsider. It hurt. It broke something, a spare key inside me. But in that breaking, it also freed me. It forced me to confront a truth I had spent years avoiding. I would never be what they wanted. And that was not my failure. It was simply the way things were. There is a profound liberation in realizing that you do not have to keep auditioning for a role you were never going to be cast in, that you do not have to keep shrinking yourself to fit into spaces that were never meant to hold your full, sprawling existence, that sometimes the greatest act of love you can offer yourself is the permission to walk away. Choosing yourself is not a one-time decision. It's a practice, a muscle you build every day. When you set boundaries, when you say no without guilt, when you pursue dreams that no one else understands, when you honor your own worth even in the face of silence or its lonely dismissal. It's hard. It's lonely at times, but it's also the only path to a life that feels authentic and whole. For so long, I thought that healing would look like reconciliation, that someday my family would see me, appreciate me, and make amends. But healing, I learned, often looks like accepting the apology you'll never receive. It looks like letting go of the hope that the past could be different, and focusing instead on building a future where you are no longer waiting for someone else's permission to be happy. It's in the small victories. The first paycheck you earn entirely on your own. The apartment you decorate without worrying about anyone else's approval. The friendships you nurture because they nourish your soul, rather than your sense of obligation. It's in waking up one morning, making coffee in your own kitchen, and realizing that you are living a life you chose, not one that was handed to you or dictated by someone else's expectations. It's in waking up one morning, in the resilience you cultivate, the ability to sit with the ache of what was missing and still move forward, to grieve the family you wish you had without letting that grief define you, to create new traditions, new homes, new relationships that reflect who you are, not who you were told to be. The most powerful lesson I took from this journey was this: you are allowed to leave places where love is conditional. You are allowed to demand more from life than borrowed kindnesses and half-hearted acceptance. You are allowed to be the hero of your own story, even if it means being the villain in someone else's. Walking away from my family's expectations wasn't an act of rebellion. Not an act of rebellion, it was an act of survival. And ultimately, it was an act of love, pure, fierce, and uncompromising. Love for the person I am, for the life I am building, for the dreams that deserve to be nurtured. No apology, without apology. There will always be people who do not see you, who do not value you, who are too wrapped up in their own narratives to make room for yours. Let them. Let them live in their, who do not see you, small, safe worlds, while you build something bigger, braver, more beautiful. Your worth is not dependent on being chosen by those who cannot see you. Your worth is inherent, unshakable, and yours to claim. In the end, the life I have now is not the one I imagined when I was a child sitting by the Christmas tree, hoping for a place at the table. It's the life I have, better. It's a life built with intention, with resilience, with a stubborn, unyielding kind of hope that says, even if they don't choose me, I will always choose myself. And that choice has made all the difference. It's made all the difference.